Hey there. All right, so today I want to talk about decision making, just briefly, because it's kind of a big topic, but I've noticed there's a lot of podcasts and books and stuff out there about how to become better at making decisions. And what I have discovered is that decision making itself is actually pretty easy. You're just choosing the best of the options that are in front of you. What can make decision making hard and where it gets complicated, and the reason there's so much literature out there about it, is the data, getting the data with which to make good decisions. That's actually the hard part. So decision making itself is easy, but getting the data you need to make good decisions is where things can get a little tricky. And decision making is one of those things we all do every day. We've been doing it our whole lives. And you might be thinking, well, why do I need to get better at decision making? If it's easy and I've already been doing it my whole life, why do I need to learn more about it? And there's a couple answers to that. One is that it helps you feel more in control of your life when you understand your options better, when you are more able to make decisions that are more likely to lead to the outcomes that you want. And even when they don't, you can at least rest assured that, well, I made the best decision that I could at the time with the information that I had. Like, my process was sound, even if the results weren't exactly what I was looking for. So it helps you feel a lot more in control of your life, and actually to be more in control in the sense that you're actually able to affect better outcomes. You're more likely to get what you want with the decisions you make when those decisions are founded on really good data. So, if you've ever looked back at something in your life, a decision that went poorly, a failure, and, in retrospect, you're like, why did I do that? Right? In retrospect, it's obvious that it was a bad idea or that it was doomed for failure, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. As all decisions do, really, when it comes right down to it, every decision we make seems like a good decision in the moment we make it. And even the decisions that we kind of suspect, oh, maybe this isn't a smart thing to do, there's still something that compels us to do it. Some emotional reason, some subconscious reasoning that is driving us to make that decision that leads us to think, no, we should do this. Even though it's risky, even though it might not succeed, we should do this. I know for me, one of the things that I have a tendency to do or have done in the past quite a bit is I'm emotionally attached to the thing that I want, the outcome that I want, the path that I want to take. And so I'll blaze ahead, even when the odds of success are not good, even when I'm not fully prepared, I go for it. Because I'm an optimist and I'm like, oh, I'm sure if I'm passionate and I work hard, it'll all work out. So that's, my emotional bias. But some people have different emotional biases. Some people, for example, are skeptics. And, they'll tend towards choosing the safe path, the path that they perceive has the least amount of risk, or is the most likely to succeed, even if it's not even exactly what they want. It might be, kind of a far cry from what they want, but the reasoning there is better to go after something safe and get it than to risk going after something that I really want and being disappointed. So those are just two examples, but of course, everybody has their own unique flavor of bias in how they make decisions. And so when you start to figure out, what are my tendencies, what are my biases, what are the things that I tend to do by default when making decisions, you can start to, I don't know, I was going to say fix, but I'm not sure that's the right word. You can start to make better decisions, not because you're denying who you are or how you like to do things, but because you have more data and you can make better decisions because those decisions are based on better data. So there is a lot of information out there about making better decisions, and really those books are really about getting the data to make better decisions, even though they say they're about decision making. But the decision is just that one point where you decide, okay, this is the option I'm going to take. Whereas what leads up to that moment where you make a decision is everything you do before that, where you're gathering data, you're gathering information. So what are we talking about with gathering data? So a lot of times people hear the word data, they think hard numbers, spreadsheets, math, that kind of thing. I'm not really talking about that kind of data so much as the data that's up here, the information in your head. So this is things like, what do you think your options are? What are you biased towards? Are you an optimist? Are you a skeptic? Do you tend towards power? Do you tend towards relationships? Like, what are your sort of personal biases? What are the outcomes that you want? And do you have a tendency to assume that the positive outcome will happen or that a negative outcome will happen? What are the risks, right? So what are the risks of taking option A versus option B? And then also, what are your priorities? And this also feeds back into our biases tend to be based on what our priorities are in our life and our values. All right, so let's talk about data. How do I get better data? Now, I'm only going to go over this briefly in this video. There's a lot more we can dive into each of these topics, and I might do that on a future video. If that's something you want me to do, just post in the comments and let me know that you'd like a video on how to do some of these things in more detail. So one of the first pieces of data that you need to get clear on is, what are your options? So a lot of times we tend to only see the obvious options in front of us. And a lot of times we think there's only two options, right? A or B. And in fact, we often have a lot more options than we think we have. But it takes some questioning and some digging to find those other options. And sometimes we think where decision making gets hard is when you have option A, which has pros and cons, and then option B, which also has pros and cons, and they're kind of evenly balanced. If option A is clearly better than option B, then that's an easy decision. When they're both kind of like, there's some pros and cons to each, and then it's hard to make a decision. So what we can do is often figure out what other options are there. And one of my favorite techniques, which is the AND solution, is figuring out how to get the best of option A, the best of option B without the negatives. But that's a whole other video. So option, understanding that you actually have more options than you think you do. And then the next thing is thinking about what your biases are in terms of outcomes. What outcome do you most want to happen? What outcome do you most fear? And do you have a tendency to be more of an optimist and believe and assume that the positive outcome will occur? Or do you tend to be more of a skeptic and assume that the worst case scenario will occur? That is how you can kind of help identify what your personal biases are and then look out for those. Another thing to think about is risk, right? What is the risk of option A versus option B versus option C? And then once you know what the risks are, and also what is the likelihood of those things happening, then you can start to ask questions like, what can I do to protect myself from these risks? Is there a way to eliminate or mitigate these risks? Is there a way I can plan for them and work around them? And then also likelihood, right? Because sometimes our fears tend to exaggerate the likelihood of the worst case scenario. But then when we look at it objectively, we realize, oh, it's not actually very likely that that will happen. But if the consequences could be really serious, then we still have to take that risk seriously, even if there's a low likelihood of success. And then the opposite is also true. If the good things that could happen if you succeed are really, really wonderful, then it's worth still considering that option and asking yourself, how can we reduce the risk and increase the likelihood that that option will succeed? And a lot of things also depend on your values and your priorities. Decision making is a very personal process, and what is the best decision for one person might not be the best decision for someone else because they have different values and different priorities. So understanding yourself and understanding what you consider to be most important in the situation is also really important. A lot of times we get confused in our decision making when we know what we want, but then others want something different from us. And so now we're having to make this decision about, do I go with what I want? Do I try to make other people happy? So that's part of that values and priorities aspect of getting data to make your decision. And then something else that's important to be aware of is that even when you have good data, even when you've explored all your options, you're aware of your biases, you've considered all the risks, how you might mitigate them, what the likelihood is of certain outcomes, even when you've done all that and you've got a lot of really good data and you say, okay, great, I know what the best decision is, there's still a possibility that you won't get the outcome you want because life doesn't work that way. It's not guaranteed, right? You can go out into the world and do things and try to make things happen, but other people and other forces in the world also have influence. And so sometimes even when you have good data and you make the best decision you can, things still don't work out exactly the way you want. But even when that happens, the fact that you can say to yourself, okay, but I did my best, right? I got the data. I made the best decision I could with the data that I had at the time. I put my best effort into it. I did the best that I could. And at the end of the day, that's all that any of us can do. And so when that happens, it's easier to let misfortune roll off our shoulders when we can say, well, I did my best, and now I'm going to do my best with this new circumstance.